My father had always been an outdoorsman. He'd spent countless hours hunting in the woods near our small town of Birch Hollow, usually alone with his dog, carrying his trusted rifle over his shoulder. On one particularly crisp autumn morning, though, something happened that would change our family forever. That day, as my father walked deeper into the forest than he ever had before, he came upon an unusual sight. Standing in the middle of the trail, blocking his path, was a group of foxes. Foxes weren't uncommon in these parts, but what was strange was how they stood still, watching him as though they had something on their minds. The largest of the foxes, a pure white one that led the group, moved closer, and to my father's astonishment, it began to speak. "Yes, you heard me right," my father later told us. "That fox spoke like a man, begging me to kill it." At first, my father thought he was imagining things. Maybe the long hours in the wilderness had started to play tricks on his mind. But the white fox continued to plead, asking to be put out of its misery. My father, who had hunted his whole life, had never encountered an animal like this. A part of him felt hesitation, but the hunter in him took over. He raised his scythe, which he used for clearing brush, and with a single strike, ended the life of the talking fox. As soon as the white fox fell, something even stranger happened. The other foxes, instead of attacking my father for killing their leader, let out a series of eerie, high-pitched cries. The sound echoed through the trees, sending a chill down his spine. Then, without warning, a bolt of lightning struck a nearby boulder, splitting it open and burying the remaining foxes beneath a pile of stones. Shaken but curious, my father stepped closer to investigate. What he saw next was something he could never have anticipated. Beneath the rocks was a large black coffin, partially exposed from the impact of the lightning. The body of the white fox had fallen right on top of it, and its blood was slowly seeping into the cracks of the coffin. At that moment, something deep inside told my father to run, and so he did. He bolted out of the woods, leaving the strange scene behind him and not looking back until he was safely at home. He arrived just in time. My mother, who was 8 months pregnant, had gone into early labor. The panic of the situation pushed aside any thoughts of the bizarre events in the woods. My father rushed her to the hospital, and by some miracle, I was born healthy, albeit a bit early. But something was wrong, something that only my grandfather seemed to sense. When we returned home, my grandfather pulled my father aside. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "You've disturbed something ancient, something dangerous," he told my father. "What happened in those woods is no ordinary event." My father, confused and a bit skeptical, explained what he had seen. When he finished, my grandfather's face darkened, and without warning, he struck my father hard across the face. "It's over," he said with a tone of finality that sent shivers down my father's spine. That night, despite the chaos of my birth and the joy of welcoming a new child, my grandfather left the house without another word. He disappeared into the night, heading back into the forest, leaving us to wonder what he knew. 3 days passed, and when he finally returned, he wasn't alone. Dragging behind him was the black coffin from the woods. He placed it in the corner of our yard, far from the house, and warned us all to stay away from it. No one was allowed near the coffin under any circumstances. He offered no further explanation, but we knew better than to question him. As I grew older, I learned bits and pieces of the story. My grandfather believed that the coffin was connected to the life my father had taken, the life of the white fox. According to him, I had been born with a prosperous fate, a life destined for greatness. But my premature birth had altered my destiny. What should have been a life of wealth and privilege had turned into one of poverty and struggle. Worse still, my life was now in constant danger. Despite this, my grandfather devoted his life to protecting me. Thanks to his efforts, I made it safely to my 15th birthday. On that day, something changed. My grandfather, always a strong and stern man, seemed frail and weak. He called me to his side and led me down to the cellar, a place I had never been allowed to enter before. As we descended the stairs, I felt a strange sense of foreboding. My grandfather had always been strict about keeping me away from the cellar, and now I was about to learn why. Inside, the cellar was not what I expected. It wasn't filled with old tools or forgotten belongings like I had imagined. Instead, at the center of the room stood an altar, and resting on the altar was the black coffin my grandfather had brought back from the woods all those years ago. My grandfather explained that starting the next day, I was to come down to the cellar and light incense at the coffin every day until my 18th birthday. He didn't explain why, but I trusted him enough not to ask. I followed his instructions, and after that day, my grandfather's health declined rapidly. He passed away a few weeks later, leaving me with a deep sense of loss and a sense that something dark still loomed over our family. For the next 3 years, I continued to perform the daily ritual, just as my grandfather had instructed. Every day, I went to the cellar, lit incense, and stared at the mysterious coffin. Wondering what lay inside, I didn't dare open it, though a part of me was tempted to find out. Then, on the morning of my 18th birthday, my father handed me an envelope. Written on it were 2 words: tying fate. Confused, I opened the envelope and found a letter from my grandfather. The letter explained that on my 18th birthday, at midnight, I was to offer one final incense stick to the coffin. If the ritual was successful, I would be able to change my destiny and live a life of wealth and prosperity. If it failed, however, my fate would be sealed. That night, I followed the instructions to the letter. I placed the coffin in the middle of the yard and set up 2 paper effigies of a boy and girl beside it. The air was thick with tension as I stood alone in the yard, waiting for the clock to strike midnight. As soon as it did, something strange happened. The paper effigies, which had been facing the coffin, suddenly turned to face me. Their hollow eyes seemed to bore into my soul, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Panicked, I hurriedly lit the final incense stick and placed it in the holder. As soon as I did, I heard a loud cracking sound coming from the coffin. Slowly, I approached, my heart racing. When I looked inside, I saw the body of a young woman lying there. Her skin was pale, but she looked as though she had only just fallen asleep. A gentle breeze swept through the yard, carrying with it a sweet floral scent. For a moment I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My grandfather had told me that I was destined to marry this woman, but how could I marry someone who was already dead? The next day, unsure of what else to do, I moved the woman's body into my room. As strange as it sounds, the room began to smell fresh, as if the very presence of her corpse was somehow purifying the air. That night, I gathered my courage and lay down beside her. Despite my fear and confusion, I drifted off to sleep. I awoke to knocking at my door. My parents were standing outside asking how I was feeling. I invited them in, and when my mother saw the woman lying beside me, she gasped. "She's beautiful," my mother said, "if only she were alive." My father sighed. "It's done. Go to your grandfather's grave and pay your respects." Later that day, I did as my father instructed. I took paper money to burn at my grandfather's grave. As I was leaving, I saw a strange man sitting by a nearby tombstone. He wore all black and seemed to be waiting for something. As I passed by, he spoke. "You won't live long," he said. Startled, I turned to face him. "What do you mean?" "The woman you married," he continued, "she won't stay with you. If you want to survive, you need to write a letter divorcing her by midnight tonight." I rushed home, terrified and confused. Should I honor my grandfather's wishes, or should I heed the warning of the stranger? Just as I was about to write the letter, a strange voice stopped me. Looking up, I saw a golden mouse standing in the doorway.